Today is our final lecture in this course, and we will be looking at the culmination of the medieval worldview and the beginning of a new period of history. We call this the Renaissance. Our historians and later medieval thinkers also called it a Renaissance. The Renaissance was a time period of rebirth of classical literature, of classical art, of bringing back many of the old ways of thinking from the Roman and Greek times. And it has a profound influence upon the European worldview, and not only in art and literature, but also within scholarship. And it forever changes sort of how people look at the world. Just their general ethos begins to change, and this is when we really begin to start to see the shift from a medieval to a modern worldview. So the Renaissance movement I have provided you a definition here to say it was a cultural and intellectual transformation in thinking from traditional medieval epistemology, how we think the way we think, and views, and instead it focused upon classical forms of art, literature, and philosophy to shift the European ethos and culture. So that's a really fancy way of saying that a new intellectual movement reformed society and changed how society viewed itself and how it behaved, how it and very much how it saw its place in history. And the Renaissance, at its heart, has several pillars, of how I like to think of it, and this is over the process of many years, many decades, even centuries. It develops from a scholastic way of thinking, from these hardline theologians such as St. Thomas Aquinas, and the great tomes that showed God's providence working in all of history from all time, instead to sort of focusing on the present and modeling how classical pieces of literature could inform the present. So this is sort of the rebirth of looking at classical texts, of classical art, and then showing how these were able to transform the individual. And it's really a hyper focus on the individual rather than just strictly on theology. So it really begins as an intellectual movement, where scholars and poets began to turn to the classical past. They found the ancient texts of Rome and Greece to be highly compelling. And so they began this focus on the individual. So we call this humanism, because it's hyper focused on sort of individual conduct and how individuals from the past can inform individuals within the present. Another key pillar of the Renaissance movement was an artistic revolution, and within sculpture, architecture, and painting, that people began to look at classical works of art, and they see that it was different than their own medieval time period, and how things looked, how sculptures looked, how realistic that they were, and they began to use perspective and to try to make things look as though they were 3D images. And then these two movements lead into, especially the intellectual revolution, sort of leads to the Protestant Reformation. And we won't be getting into that. We're going to cut this course off before we get into the Reformation period. But the Reformation is a tumultuous time period, an intellectual religious movement that just shakes the foundations of the church and sort of the long-held religious views of the church and within society, but it is linked to this Renaissance movement. And then the Reformation leads to the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is a transformation in thinking, that it is a hyper focus on secularism instead of sort of explaining things through theology. Instead, the individual becomes the basis of authority and reason instead of God and Scripture. That they will turn to rationality and individual judgment. So it's a hyper focusing on the individual. And finally, the scientific revolution, which comes from the Enlightenment and also the Reformation movement. And this is a way of discovering new relearning ancient mathematical forms and then perfecting them, making them better, and then also using these mathematical forms to create new inventions, to discover new things about the cosmos, to theorize about how the molecular universe works. And so all of these are really linked and begin within the earliest times of the Renaissance movement, which began, as I say, as an intellectual pursuit of turning back to the classics. That the scholars and poets wanted to bring back the individual into society, and this, in turn, leads us down the road to the scientific revolution. So let us begin by looking at humanism. And humanism specifically, really, it heavily emphasizes the importance of the individual and individual virtue. And if you are a virtuous person, then you can make great contributions to society. And these are our works. And this contrasts to the medieval view. That sort of the religious life of the monk and nun is the highest. This is sort of the epitome of what you can do to be great and glorious, and to sort of have the highest virtues and ethics is to be a sequestered monk or nun and pursue the religious life in contemplation and focusing on God, to shirk the world. Remember long ago in our lecture on monks and nuns that you become dead to the world. Well, humanism says no, this really isn't what we should be doing. We should be using our Christianity and our thinking, our rationality, to transform ourselves into virtuous, ethical, good people that can then make society a better place. That we have something to contribute. That it's not just God who's the mover and shaker of all things, and that we are just pawns within this grand scheme, but rather we can make a genuine contribution as individuals to society to make it a better place. And they suggested that how do you become a virtuous person? Well, you have to be inspired to be a virtuous person. And how do you do that? You look to the classical past. You look to the great heroes of the Roman and Greek world. You look to people like Cincinnatus, or to the great hero Horatius Cocles, who were inspired to be virtuous citizens who laid down power, even though they could have amassed enormous power as dictators and such things. But they were virtuous, good citizens of the Roman Republic, and by reading these stories and allowing that to inform your own worldview, the humanists believe that this would create within their own society a movement that would make society a better place. And there was also a spice of Christian theology within this as well, that they don't say in any way that it's not good to be Christian, but rather they emphasize the works of Jesus of Nazareth, and they encourage that. They encourage good works in the world instead of sort of shutting yourself away and it being a private life about prayer within a monastery. So this movement originated in northern Italy because it was the commercial urban center of medieval Europe, and we'll get into that in a moment. But really, the founding father, if you can would call him that, and I think that's is appropriate, is Francisco Petrarca, or Petrarch in English rendering. And he's a great poet, and he very much saw the classical literature as a way to sort of transform everything about scholarship and poetry, that he could make far more beautiful poetry and write much better history if he adopted this new style of turning to sort of classical modes of style and writing, rather than just continuing on with the medieval tome. So he revolutionizes how people do scholarship and also write literature. And he also comes up with this notion of the Middle Ages, or a medieval age, that as he looked back on time, that he saw a glowing and beautiful light within the classical world, within ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And then he saw an eclipse of this light around the year 500. And that ushered in a dark age where there was no Latin written anymore. The Latin that was written was pathetic, and it was poor, and there was no great literature that was written. The light in the world of art faded away, that it basically didn't exist for 1,000 years. And Petrarch then saw his own time, this just at the tail end of the 1300s, as a illuminated world, a rebirth of this time. So he saw this as a bringing back of the light of the classical literature, of classical art, and a transition from this dark Middle Age between the classical era and his own time. So this is really when we call something the Middle Ages or medieval, this is what we are referring to, that the humanists have given us this belief that the Middle Ages was a dark time, nothing good was happening, but rather only good comes from the light of the classics. And Petrarch begins to recognize anachronism within art as well as scholarship. And meaning that when you look at a work of art and you see sort of a religious scene, and the individuals within this scene are dressed in 13th century clothes dating from the time of the gospel, or the scene is from the time of Christ and his disciples, and they are dressed to look just like medieval Europeans. They have flowing blonde hair and such things like this. That is anachronism. It's incorrect. It's placing present thought and action, dress, words upon the past, and Petrarch sort of recognizes this, that not only within art but also within scholarship and writing. And he tries to end he suggests it would be better to end the tome like the Thomas Aquinas's great work, rather than sort of trying to explain every single thing away and to depict God's providence in all things and at all times, and answer every single little question to everything. Rather, that one needed to focus on particular individuals and how these individuals shaped society, and then, of course, how these lessons could be taught in a moral way, that it would inculcate virtue within his own time. So Petrarch is a big figure that starts this new movement. And I love this quote from Petrarch, that it is better to will the good than know the truth. And the humanists really attacked scholastic thinkers, the late scholastic thinkers, because scholastic thinkers wanted to prove everything. They wanted to know the absolute truth of every single question, and this is how they approached their scholarship. So they literally did argue whether if a church mouse eats a little bit of the transubstantiated host the communion offering of Christ's body, that whether the mouse became a sanctified object. They argued for some 50 years over how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. The answer is 47, if you were wondering. So just questions like this were just debated exhaustively based upon scripture and theology, the tradition of the church fathers, etc., etc. Humanists just said, this does not matter. It is better. Who cares how many angels you can prove dance on a pin? And I don't care how you can prove it. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant in this life. So it's better to will the good than to know the truth. And therefore, we need to be teaching people, instead of the sort of truths within philosophy, we need to teach them how to be good citizens. We need to teach them how to talk properly, to argue, and ultimately to be virtuous, good people within society, and how to inculcate these virtues in other people. So what do the intellectuals, really hard-line intellectuals, such as Desiderius Erasmus, who is sort of is a later humanist than Petrarch. He comes in the late 1400s and 1500s. Really is one of the fathers of the Reformation, but he's part of this movement. And the great rallying cry of the humanists are ADFontes, which means in Latin, back to the sources. That they weren't that interested. They were interested. That's a lie. They were interested in what St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas thought. But through the Middle Ages, these people, these great theologians of the church, such as Augustine and Aquinas, took on sort of their own aura of infallibility. That they were seen as sort of the great commentators on Scripture, and people didn't go back to the original documents that Augustine and Aquinas were writing about. Rather, they just knew Aquinas, they just knew Augustine. They didn't actually know how to interpret the original language and scriptures that within the Christian Bible. And so therefore, the humanists say ADFontes. I'm not going to read Aquinas. I'm not going to read the scriptures through Aquinas' eyes. Rather, I'm going to go back to the original sources, and I'm going to read them in their original language. The Bible had been translated by St. Jerome in the 5th century into the Vulgate that we have still today, if you wish to read it. But it's the Latin translation of the Bible. Of course, the Bible is not written in Latin, any of it. Written in its original language. It's written in Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew, and these languages were virtually unknown in the medieval West until sort of the late 1400s. And then they began to learn Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, and through these languages, they're able to sort of read the Bible in its original context. And they also wanted to stress that you have to read a document within its proper historical context. And I would stress this still as a historian today. You don't want to know what a text says, but you want to know what a text means. Because words transform radically over the course of time. Words disappear, so therefore we have to read exhaustively within the time period that you're studying, and to understand what the language means and not just what it says. For instance, if I was to say, if you have a driving license in the United States and you come upon a octagon sign that says stop right in the middle of it, and you stop, well, you should still be sitting there, because that sign literally means halt. It means to cease movement permanently if you say stop. But it actually means pause. So if you came upon a stop sign in 500 years from now, people would likely not understand what this meant. They might be able to read and know that it said, okay, well, that means to cease movement, to stop. It meant to, to completely stop movement. In reality, it means just pause. So you have to really understand the context, the historical context of writing and words in order to appreciate them. And this is what the humanists really taught, that they want to understand what something means, not just what it says. So this is a fancy word for this as we develop in the modern period is called philology. So we try to understand the evolution of language. And these are all English language here. And this is, if you look up here in the top right-hand corner, this is early English. This is the earliest form of English, often referred to as Anglo-Saxon. So this is the earliest form of the language I am speaking, and that probably most of you are speaking. But I predict not many of you can read this. My Anglo-Saxon once was okay, but I would struggle to get through much of this. But this is actually from Beowulf, the great epic, the Anglo-Saxon epic. Then, if you look below, directly below the into the bottom right-hand corner, this is Middle English, and this is from Chaucer. Now, you can make some sense of this, but natheless will I have time to space, ere that I fetter this tale pace. Methinketh, in according to reason, to tell ye all the condition. Right? So you can read, you can make a little sense of this. This is Middle English. So the top right-hand corner here is written, in the around the year 750, 800, something of that nature. That was probably penned. So then Chaucer, written in the 14th century, and then if we go over to the left one more time, we see here from Shakespeare. So you can make some sense of Elizabethan English, and but you noticing how the language is radically changing over the course of time. This is about not quite 1,000 years from Shakespeare to Beowulf. And then if you look up, this is an excerpt from a Victorian piece here. I believe this is Hemingway that I have on here. So you can read the language of Hemingway, but it's different than this text messaging over here. If you put LOL within a document from, let's say, even 1980, nobody is going to know what you meant by that in 1980. If you transported back in time and you said, ha, LOL. So you can see here the evolution of language, the evolution of human language, and it changes radically over the course of 1,000 years. And scriptural tradition was no different, and so therefore it was sought by the humanist that they would go back and try to learn this original context, so they would actually know what the scripture said and what these authorities were actually what they meant, rather than just reading what it said, and to get the most accurate translations. ADFontes, back to the sources. And actually, one great issue that happened from this humanist learning was one of the humanist scholars, whose name was Lorenzo Valla. He was a highly trained humanist, and he was able to go through the Vatican archives, and he pulls up the Donation of Constantine, which is the Pope's claim to absolute authority over the church. This was a document that the popes had cited for their authority over the universal church, and also that they were emperors of the West, of the western part of the empire, the Roman Empire. And what they claimed was the Emperor Constantine, all the way back in the 4th century, had given them this donation, that he had given the emperorship of the West over to the papacy. Not the man who was pope, but the papacy itself. And with this came the authority of the emperor, that he could make decrees, the pope could make decrees, and could govern the West as effectively an emperor over all other monarchs and lords. So this is tremendously important document for papal authority and power. Only problem was Lorenzo Valla discovered that the original document was written many centuries after the death of Constantine. Because of the language, he said, well, this is actually written much later, that it was a medieval document rather than a classical document written in the 300s. It was probably written in the 700s or 800s. So therefore, he sort of destroys his own patron, and he's obviously not very welcome within the Vatican Library after the discovery that this donation of Constantine document was a forgery. So why does humanism really originate in Italy? Well, first of all, because the commercial revolution that is sort of happening or the trade revolution that begins around 1100, it really starts in northern Italy because of their proximity to the origins, the fount of trade in the East. That they are the middlemen between the Byzantine merchants from Constantinople, as well as the Muslim merchants who are at the end of the Silk Road and have all the valuable stuff from China that the rest of the Europeans want. So therefore, they're able to make a very large amount of money from being the source of trade in Europe, and these Italians in their little city-states in the north of Italy, they are able to build up enormous trade empires and banking empires because of all this wealth that is flowing through their lands. Also, because of this, they're able to become more urban. People come from the countryside. They support this trade industry, all the supporting industries that go into large trading empires and banking and these kinds of things, hosting market areas. It creates an urban environment. So northern Italy becomes sort of the fount of trade and culture within Europe, and this is and people who can live in large urban environments and have plenty of money, have the opportunity and ability to have leisure time in order to do things like think and produce scholarship and poetry. When you're not having to work on a farm for your subsistence, you can sit in a library and read and attempt to understand sort of the deeper truths of philosophy and think about things. And after the period of the Black Death, which is in the Great Dying, as well as all the plagues of the early 14th century and the mid 14th century, simply new opportunities for how to spend your money. If you survived the Black Death, you were still part of a good trading empire, though it shrunk. But you have to come up with new ways to spend your money, because many of these great supporting industries and businesses failed. So therefore, these rich families, these aristocrats, decided to become patrons of art instead of spending their money on something else, like a shipbuilding firm or something of that nature. So these wealthy families, such as the Medici, would go to the most famous artists, and they would patronize them, and also they would patronize scholars to go and investigate things that they were interested in. And through this is really the first intellectual movement that was led by lay people, meaning people who were not clerics or monks, since around the year 500. So this is a really powerful transformation of sort of who are the intellectual elite, and it shifts from being churchmen to lay individuals who are kind of professorial types. And also why is this also? Because, well, these cities are growing in size and they are growing in bureaucracy. throughout the 1400s and 1500s, and they need bureaucrats to sort of run these bigger, as governments become bigger and bigger, and therefore they needed people who were well trained, who could read, who could reason, and who could argue. Monks are not typically cut out for this. They don't do these things very well, and so it's a new style of bureaucrats that are put into these systems. So I just want to take a moment and sort of look at Florence, because this is the queen city of the Renaissance. And Florence becomes an intellectual center because it had a university, but it had opened, it had closed. It was not doing well as a scholastic university, or the old style of curriculum, the Thomas Aquinas style curriculum, Peter Abelard, these kind of guys. And so they just simply couldn't cut it with the greater universities, who were the mighty scholastic universities like the University of Bologna or Paris. So there was a particular chancellor of Italy named Coletio Salutate, and he basically goes around Italy and he collects every humanist that he can find, and he brings them there and he says, look, we're going to pay you a lot of money because we have a lot of money, and we're going to found a really cutting edge university here in Florence, and we're going to make it one of these new humanist schools. And so then he also employs Leonardo Bruni to write a history of Florence in the humanist fashion, sort of glorifying its great heroes as virtuous and good citizens. And also they're going to go out and get some great artists to start patronizing the city, such as Donatello and Brunelleschi. And eventually then, as the Medici come to power, such as Cosimo de' Medici and Lorenzo de' Medici, they are also going to continue to patronize the arts. They're going to spend their money on art instead of other things, and just transform Florence into a magnificent city. And through this university and the Medici becoming the Pope's bankers and having just voluminous amounts of money, they brought all the leading artists to Florence, and they were able to therefore just have magnificent works of Renaissance art, and become training centers throughout Italy for sort of intellectual humanists, as well as bureaucrats within governments. And I think within what is so attractive about humanism, and why did late medieval people become so drawn to this? Well, I think there's a degree of just escapism within these new curriculums that you just simply don't have within a medieval curriculum. If you go through the works of Thomas Aquinas, and your job every day is to sort of grade papers and give lectures on the minutiae of Duns Scotus and Thomas Aquinas and theological treatises, I think there's just something beautiful when you pick up Livy and you begin to read about these glorious heroes that made the Roman Republic, and the stories, the exciting stories that come with this, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and there's just something that as you read this, you just sort of escape and go into a different world. And this is something that's very attractive about the humanist curricula that is different from the scholastic curricula. And we need to just take a moment and discuss art. And I would say I am no expert as art goes, but one does not need to be an expert to see a differentiation between medieval art, which is, you can see here on your right-hand side, which is very two-dimensional or even one-dimensional, and it shows people who are dressed as medieval people here crucifying Christ and or a saint, or whatever it might be, and it's just they're not very well drawn. This would be in any freshman level class or sophomore level class. Anybody could do this, but these are the finest artists of the Middle Ages. They never signed their work because they didn't want any credit for this. Now you can look over here to a Caravaggio painting of David severing the head of Goliath there on the left-hand side, and this is a radical transformation from the piece of art on the right-hand side. So you see the differing techniques, the use of light and shading to create three-dimensional image that is just stunningly beautiful. Just a magnificent work of art here. And other artists will begin to use this kind of perspective to transform the 3D, just normally two-dimensional images into three-dimensional images, where it's just almost leaping off the canvas from what they're doing. And here you can see one of the most famous artists of the Renaissance, of course, was Michelangelo. And he famously paints the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and in the Vatican, as well as he carves this great statue of David. So he's in one person probably the great, unquestionably the greatest sculptor of the Renaissance, and he's probably a very strong argument to be made that he was also the greatest painter. So this is just incredible that one human being could do all that Michelangelo did, and still today people pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to come and see his great works. And also we see, along with sculpture and painting, we see architecture. So here you can see the Florence Duomo, or the great cathedral in the heart of Florence, designed by Giotto, and you can see the domes that were able to be created by Renaissance artists that previous medieval architects could not, because of the rediscovery of new mathematical techniques and formulas and inspiration, that they wanted to make this look more like the classical world. So the churches they designed and are just beautiful in their own rights, but they are also modeled on more classical forms of architecture. And I think within the Renaissance, we see the transformation of just simply the artist. As I said, medieval artists did not sign anything because they did not want credit for it. The goal was to destroy the individual within medieval ethos. And within the new movement, you signed your work. You wanted to be known that this was a Michelangelo, or I have a Michelangelo, or a Donatello, or whatever, Raphael. I have one of these paintings, and these are these great artists who produce these things. So it changes that the individual is important. The person who did this is important, and this artist can then kind of become immortal in many ways, because if their work is great enough that someone, say, 500 years would be teaching a class about how important their contributions to human society and art and literature were. And we discussed sort of the editing of Scripture and philology, but sacred Scripture was something that really they believed that medieval people believed just should not and could not be changed whatsoever. And Desiderius Erasmus, who I mentioned earlier, he edits the Bible, and it's this very controversial project. He gets in trouble for this. Ultimately, he doesn't get excommunicated or thrown out of the church or anything, almost, but he ultimately takes Greek manuscripts and edits the Bible. He says there are many things that are translated inaccurately, that they had discovered new manuscripts in libraries throughout Europe and the ancient world, and through the use of language and understanding Scripture within context, they were able to create a more accurate translation of the biblical text. And sometimes it would have strong impacts upon a particular important or key verse that did not necessarily ebb away the foundations of the church, but it did question some of the claims that had been long made by the medieval church, and this is one of the reasons that brings about the Reformation period, and where the church has to sort of rethink how it does things. New technologies began to spring up, and shortly following the the beginnings of the Renaissance. The individual is important. The individual needs to read in order to understand how to be a good, virtuous, and ethical person. And therefore, the printing press, the screw printing press, which allows for the creation of text to be made very quickly, was invented by Gutenberg. And then later, now there were other forms of printing presses that existed before this, but none that could do the work as quickly as Gutenberg's. So this emphasizes not only the need or the advent of the technology, but the desire, right? The demand for works of literature and scripture, that people wanted to read these things. In the Middle Ages, literacy was not something that was considered important. You just would turn to the church or some paid scribe to read and write things for you. But in the beginning in the Renaissance, it's important that you as an individual are able to read, so you can see these virtuous characters from the past and allow those to shape your life and to make you a more virtuous person, that you can then inculcate this into other people. Gunpowder also begins to appear in Europe about this time. I mean, it really then the true gunpowder of the cannon and the arbacross weapon, the primitive form of the matchlock musket. And this transforms warfare and how people fight. Constantinople had not been taken by siege ever. And other than during the Crusades, the great city had never, ever fallen to a siege until the advent of cannons. Its walls were considered impregnable until you could blow them away with a cannon in a short amount of time. So in 1453, it is decimated by Suleiman the Magnificent. And therefore, the city of Constantinople is renamed Istanbul and becomes a Muslim city. So gunpowder transforms everything. So we're seeing these new technologies that are coming into the world, creating much more of a feel of a modern world than the older medieval world, and it's shaping new things. It's creating new norms. It's redefining geography. It's redefining the individual. It's redefining everything about how they thought and what they considered their culture to be, what was important within their culture, how they approached their faith. So this is just simply a new and radical way of looking at things differently. This is a transformative time. The Renaissance movement ushered in the modern world, and sort of it begins the small stones that starts the avalanche all the way down to the scientific revolution, to sort of moving into our own modern ways of thinking and sort of how we conceptualize ourselves within the universe. That this is really the kind of the break in time between the medieval and the modern period. So thank you very much for taking this course. Thank you for listening to these lectures. And I hope that you have come to have a deeper appreciation and understanding of the world of the Middle Ages in Europe and the ancient world. And I would just ask that you think about some of these things, that you would grow in your virtues as the historians of the humanist era and the Renaissance suggested, and that you would come to know more about the world and appreciate your place within it. So again, thanks for watching, and until next time, stay healthy, wealthy, and